The last message I sent before the entire foundation of my career at Aegis Financial Technologies was dismantled was a pull request comment. It was a simple, technical note that read, "Please review the updated fraud trigger logic. It finally catches synthetic internet protocol trails without overfitting. Should reduce false positives by 19%. I submitted that message on a Friday evening, packing up my laptop with a quiet sense of satisfaction. I was 55 years old, a senior risk systems architect who had spent the better part of a decade building the back-end defenses of this company. I did not expect a parade, but I did expect my code to be there on Monday morning. Instead, when I logged in while eating stale pretzels in the break room and avoiding the sales director, the pull request was gone. The entire repository was gone. I refreshed my screen twice, but only a cold, digital 404 error stared back at me. It was as if my work had never existed. Then came the message from Julian Croft, our director of development. There was no greeting, no polite sign-off. It simply stated, "Hi, Daniel. For transparency, the predictive risk engine has been reassigned to Toby Miller for his summer rotation. Please provide a detailed knowledge transfer document by the end of the day." I laughed so loudly that a junior developer near the espresso machine dropped her cup. Toby Miller was a summer intern who had recently asked me if the back-end database was where the email attachments were stored. His only contribution to the repository during his entire 4-week tenure had been changing a button color to a specific shade of blue, which had promptly broken the layout styling for our dark mode interface. Yet, the executives had decided that my months of research and development were a learning opportunity for a family friend of a board member. Julian Croft did not even have the decency to call it a demotion. It was wrapped in corporate jargon about cross-functional growth. What Julian Croft and the rest of the leadership team forgot, however, was that I did not build the core engine in isolation. I had spent years watching the company cut corners, and I had designed the architecture like a fortress. More importantly, I had left behind just enough scaffolding to ensure that anyone who tried to climb it without my key would fall. I went home early, ignoring the Slack notifications piling up on my screen. In the quiet of my living room, I opened my personal computer. The radiator in my old house wheezed softly, a familiar background noise to my late-night coding sessions. I poured myself a flat cola and sat in the glow of my dual monitors. I was not about to let a 20-something intern and a short-sighted director steal the crown jewel of my professional career. I began drafting a migration script. It was not designed to transfer the repository back to me, but rather to clean it of my proprietary algorithms. The company believed the predictive risk engine was a standard, plug-and-play fraud filter. They thought they could swap out a senior architect for an intern, slap a few tasks on a dashboard, and call it a day. But they had no understanding of what was buried deep within the codebase. The magic of the engine did not belong to the company. The algorithm that made it function was drafted entirely outside of my official working hours. I had designed it on my personal laptop, modeled it using public sandbox datasets, and completed the tests on my own time. Under California Labor Code Section 2870, because the work was created entirely on my own time, without company resources, and was not an explicit deliverable of my contract. At the time of creation, the intellectual property belonged to me. The company held a license to use it, but they did not own the source code. I had been careful. I possessed complete, timestamp version control backups. Every commit, every mathematical model, every test run was logged on my personal server. I began looking at the commit history. I located the specific commit hash from Friday. It was a hash that contained only letters, a unique identifier that read if80bc. It was the last clean version of the software. I ran my script. It executed silently, removing the core logic and replacing the behavior matrix with a simple dummy file. It was a clean extraction. I did not inject anything malicious. I simply withdrew my private property. Toby would have the wrapper, the user interface, and the basic configuration files, but the brain of the system was gone. Before I closed my laptop, I made one final backup. I saved every Slack message, every email, and every meeting note. I had a paper trail that went back 6 months, detailing exactly how the project had been funded and managed. I knew the law, and I knew my rights under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 201, which defined the boundaries of employee creations. I went to bed that night with a quiet smile. The sprint review was scheduled for Monday morning at 10 o'clock. The executives were walking into a presentation, holding what they believed was a polished product, but they were actually holding an empty shell. I had set the stage, and all I had to do now was watch the show unfold. Sunday night, at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning, my house was dead quiet. The only sound was the radiator wheezing in the corner of the room, sounding like an old man trying to clear his throat. I was still wearing the same gray hoodie I had put on Friday morning, its cuffs slightly stiff from dried soy sauce and the sweat of nervous anticipation. The glow from my dual monitors cast a cold blue light across the living room, illuminating the clutter of empty soda cans and paper plates. In the dark, it looked like a crime scene, and in a way I was not just migrating a repository. I was performing a careful, systematic autopsy on my own creation. I went through the codebase line by line, commit by commit, checking the virtual fingerprints I had left behind. I wanted to make absolutely sure that my ownership of the proprietary modules was clean, clear, and indisputable. The leadership at Aegis Financial Technologies did not understand what they were trying to take. To them, the predictive risk engine was just a simple filter, a piece of corporate plumbing they could assign to an intern to save on development costs. They thought they could slap some tasks on a dashboard, call it agile progress, and present it to the board as a cost-cutting victory. They had no idea that the engine was actually powered by a silent observer module I had named Stingray. Stingray was not a standard fraud filter that looked at basic rules or block lists. It was a behavioral profiling engine that analyzed transaction logs over time. It learned how legitimate users behaved, tracking subtle details like the speed at which they filled out forms, how they corrected typos in their passwords in the middle of the night, and how they moved their cursors. When a professional fraud ring attempted to simulate human behavior, they could never quite replicate that organic randomness. Stingray flagged those discrepancies with near-perfect accuracy. I had built the core mathematics of Stingray on my personal computer, using open-source packages and synthetic datasets that I had generated myself. I did not use a single line of company code, nor did I use their servers or office network to run the training models. I did the research late at night, long after my official work hours had ended. The company contract was clear. They owned the work I did on their time, using their equipment to solve their specific operational problems. But they did not own the independent research I conducted on my own resources. When Toby Miller, the intern, cloned the repository, on Sunday morning, he received a notification that the build was complete. I had received a digital ping on my phone when his staging credentials accessed the server, but Toby did not notice that the core algorithm was missing. I had scrubbed the repository of the actual behavior matrix and the anomaly classifier. In their place, I had inserted a dummy module. It was a simple script that returned a hard-coded response of all good. To anyone who did not understand the underlying architecture, it would look like the system was running perfectly. The test would pass because I had modified the assertions to expect the dummy data. It was a shell, empty of the logic that actually did the work of detecting fraud. Meanwhile, I pushed the complete, unredacted codebase of Stingray to a private repository titled Stingray Requiem. I documented every single commit, explaining the mathematical foundations of the algorithms and providing a detailed structural map. I also created a slide deck designed for the Chief Technology Officer, detailing how the engine worked and why the intellectual property belonged to me. I secured the private repository behind biometric double-factor authentication, ensuring that no one from Aegis Financial Technologies could access it without my physical presence. Then, I spent 3 hours compiling a document that compared my research and development hours against my company time card. It was a comprehensive 17-page report. I included screenshots of Git history, network logs showing the private IP addresses of my home server, and Slack messages from my manager, Julian Croft. In those messages, Julian had explicitly told me that the behavioral profiling project was not part of this quarter's deliverables and that I should not spend company time on it. He had essentially given me written permission to build it on my own time. I attached a copy of California Labor Code Section 2870 to the very front of the document. This statute was my shield. It clearly stated that any invention developed by an employee entirely on their own time, without using the employer's equipment, supplies, facilities, or trade secret information, belonged solely to the employee. The company had no claim to the copyright or the patent rights. I knew the company would try to claim ownership under the work-made-for-hire doctrine, but my documentation was airtight. I had the timestamps, the emails, and the code history to prove that the work was created independently. I was ready for the confrontation. As the clock ticked toward 3 in the morning, I closed my laptop. My eyes were burning from the screen glare, but I felt a deep sense of peace. I had spent 15 years working for companies that took credit for my labor and discarded me when it was convenient. This time, I had built a fortress around my work. They had the shell, but I had the soul of the machine. The morning sprint review would be the moment they realized they had stolen nothing but a name. Monday morning arrived with the usual gray corporate energy. The sprint review was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and the virtual meeting room filled up quickly. I sat in my home office, sipping black coffee, my camera turned off and my microphone muted. In the main office conference room, there were plates of cold bagels and cups of cheap coffee. I could see Julian Croft through the webcam, standing at the head of the table, projecting his usual high-energy, television host persona. Julian kicked things off with his signature enthusiasm. Today, Toby Miller is going to walk us through the exciting upgrades to our risk engine, Julian announced, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. He has taken the foundational work drafted by Daniel Vance and approached it with fresh eyes and agile momentum. We are looking at a much more streamlined, scalable architecture. Fresh eyes and agile momentum. I rolled my eyes in the dark of my room. It was the corporate translation of. We took a senior architect's complex proprietary system and handed the keys to an unpaid intern to save money. Toby Miller shared his screen. He looked nervous but proud, grinning at the camera like a child who had just finished his first drawing. He started clicking through a presentation deck. I recognized the overall structure, but the content had been completely hollowed out. My detailed mathematical flowcharts, which showed the multi-layered neural network and the data pipeline, had been replaced with bright, cartoonish icons and marketing phrases like next-generation fraud synergy. Then, Toby tabbed over to the terminal to show the live code interface. I watched his cursor hover over the directory structure. He scrolled up, then down, then up again. I could see the moment confusion set in. His cursor began to jerk erratically across the screen. So this is the core fraud detection logic we are using, Toby began, his voice cracking slightly on the word logic. I refactored some of the legacy variables to streamline the return values and make the system easier to read. Legacy variables. He was referring to the proprietary behavioral anomaly classifier that had flagged and prevented over $3 million in synthetic transaction fraud in the last quarter alone. To Toby, code he did not understand was simply legacy. Toby cleared his throat and initiated the test suite to demonstrate the live fraud verification system. He clicked the execution button and waited. The terminal flashed. The tests ran in less than a second. The screen did not display the usual multi-page diagnostic log, the database query performance, or the anomaly detection matrices. Instead, the screen printed one lonely, simple line of text. All good. Then, the terminal stopped. There was a heavy, uncomfortable silence. It was not the kind of silence caused by a poor internet connection or a lagging application. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room full of people realizing something was terribly wrong. Julian Croft squinted at the screen, his corporate smile faltering. Toby, where are the diagnostic outputs? Where is the behavioral matrix and the anomaly classifier? Toby began to stammer, his face flushing a bright, dark red. I think there might be a version mismatch. We had some weird merge conflicts when we imported the repository into our main development branch. I unmuted my microphone. My voice was calm, measured, and completely devoid of emotion. The original repository did include those modules, Julian, I said, the sound of my voice cutting through the panic in the room. But I assumed Toby did not need them. After all, you mentioned he was approaching the project with fresh eyes. I assumed he had developed his own logic. Toby stared at his webcam, his eyes wide. Julian Croft frowned, his tone sharpening. Daniel, this is not the time for professional disagreements. We need the active risk engine running for the production release tomorrow. Where is the code? I dropped the hammer. You might want to check the Git history, Julian. Look for the commit hash EFADBC. It was the last clean version of the software before the Stingray behavioral profiling engine was extracted. However, I doubt Toby will be able to access that commit. Why not? Julian asked, his voice rising in irritation. Because that code is my private property, I replied. The behavioral profiling engine was developed entirely on my own time, on my personal equipment, and using my own research. It is not company property. I worked on it outside of my official duties, and under California Labor Code, Section 2870, the intellectual property remains mine. Aegis Financial Technologies has a license to use the basic risk wrapper, but the proprietary machine learning algorithms are mine, and they have been returned to my private repository. The meeting room went dead quiet. Then, a voice spoke up from the speaker. It was Harvey Stone, the Chief Technology Officer. I had not even realized he was on the call. Daniel, did you document this separation? Harvey asked, his voice low and serious. I leaned closer to my microphone. Yes, Harvey, I did. I have compiled a complete 17-page intellectual property audit. It contains time-stamped Git commits, the external repository records, and the written instructions from Julian telling me not to work on the behavioral engine during company hours. I have just sent the full report to your inbox, along with a presentation deck titled Stingray Requiem. I did not wait for a response. I clicked the button to leave the call, shutting down the meeting window. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee. The thermonuclear device had been detonated, and now all they could do was breathe in the ash. I did not log back into the company network for the rest of that Monday. Instead, I spent the afternoon in my kitchen, heating up some leftover Chinese food and sipping green tea. I had disabled my corporate chat client, but I kept a browser tab open to monitor the traffic logs on my private server. The traffic graph was spiking like a heart monitor during a cardiac arrest. The server security logs revealed multiple failed attempts to access my private repository. Someone using the company virtual private network was trying to log in using an old set of staging credentials. I smiled, realizing how desperate they had become. They were looking for a backdoor, hoping to clone the Stingray engine before I could secure it further. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my personal email inbox began to fill up. The first message was from Harvey Stone, the Chief Technology Officer. It was polite, almost deferential, asking if we could connect to discuss the impressive work I had done on the behavioral engine. The second email, sent 40 minutes later, was much more anxious. Harvey wanted to clarify the intellectual property boundaries and mentioned that the internal legal team had a few standard questions. I did not reply. I wanted them to sit in their panic for a while longer. I knew that without the behavioral engine, the upcoming release of their financial platform would fail its security audits, leaving Aegis Financial Technologies vulnerable to transaction fraud. Later that evening, I checked my professional social media profile. The inbox was filled with messages from recruiters and directors at competing firms. The word was already spreading that the senior risk architect at Aegis had built a revolutionary detection engine. I left the messages unread. I was waiting for a specific communication from the decision makers. It arrived on Tuesday morning. The email came from Clara Jenkins, the internal legal counsel for the firm. The subject line was marked as urgent and privileged. The message invited me to a video conference at 3:30 in the afternoon to resolve what she called the recent confusion surrounding the development lineage and ownership of the Stingray module. I replied with a brief confirmation and spent the rest of the morning preparing my materials. On my desktop, I had a folder labeled in case of emergency. It contained 3 critical pieces of evidence. The first was a high-definition screen recording of the sprint review from the previous day. It clearly captured Toby Miller fumbling through the files, unable to explain how the neural network functioned, and admitting that he had tried to refactor variables he did not understand. It was clear proof that the company did not possess the technical capability to maintain the software without me. The second file was a saved chat conversation from the 2nd of March. In it, Brenda Reynolds, the Human Resources Director, had instructed me in writing to keep my behavioral research project separate from my daily duties. She had explicitly stated that if the project was not part of the current quarterly deliverables, I should work on it in my own time. The third and most important file was an audio recording. I had captured it by pure chance 2 weeks earlier when I was retrieving my jacket from the hallway closet near the executive offices. My phone's recording app had been running, and it had captured a clear, distinct conversation between Julian Croft and Brenda Reynolds. "Just give the project to the intern," Julian's voice said on the recording. "Daniel is too attached to it anyway. If he decides to quit, he quits. We already have the code in the repository." It was the smoking gun. It proved that the company had acted in bad faith, intending to strip me of my work and push me out of the firm once they believed they had secured the repository. At exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, I clicked the link to join the video conference. Clara Jenkins was already on the call, looking exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes, visible even through the low-resolution webcam. Beside her sat Oliver Sinclair, a member of the executive board. He was wearing an expensive designer hoodie, trying to project a casual, modern tech executive image, but his posture was tense. Clara began the conversation with a practiced, warm smile. "Daniel, thank you for joining us," she said. "We are hoping to come to a mutual understanding about where the Stingray engine fits within the company's operational framework. You have done some remarkable work, and we want to ensure we honor your contributions." I did not return the smile. I simply shared my screen and opened the folder. First, I showed them the time cards and the server logs, matching the hours of code commits to my personal IP addresses. Then, I played the audio recording of Julian Croft and Brenda Reynolds. As the recording played, I watched their faces. By the 3rd minute, Oliver Sinclair stopped leaning back in his chair and sat up straight, his face turning pale. By the time the audio file finished playing, Clara's professional smile had completely vanished. I leaned closer to my camera. "I have no desire to initiate a lawsuit," I said quietly, "but I have every intention of protecting what is mine. If we cannot reach an agreement today, I will publish a detailed article on a public platform detailing how this firm attempts to misappropriate the intellectual property of its senior engineers. I have the files, the recordings, and the legal foundation. The choice is yours." At that moment, the door to the virtual conference room opened and Brenda Reynolds joined the call. She looked flustered, her hair slightly messy, and her voice was pitched higher than normal. "Apologies for the delay," Brenda said, trying to smooth down her blazer. "I had a last-minute conflict. Daniel, I am glad we are all here. I want to assure you that there has been a simple miscommunication regarding the Stingray module. We deeply value the innovation you have brought to Aegis Financial Technologies, and we want to work together." I cut her off before she could finish. "You do not need to value anything, Brenda," I said, my voice cold. "You just need to admit what you did. I have the Slack messages where you told me to work on this off hours. I have the network log showing the code was built on my own server. And I have the recording of you and Julian Croft planning to reassign my project to Toby and push me out of the company." Brenda's face went completely white. She looked off-screen, likely looking for support from Julian, who was not on the call. "Daniel," Clara Jenkins interrupted, her voice soft and placating. "We understand your position. We want to resolve this in a way that protects the interests of both parties. What are your terms?" I leaned back in my chair. "First, I want full retroactive attribution for the Stingray behavioral profiling engine. My name must be listed as the sole author in all system documentation and repositories. Second, I want a public correction posted in the main engineering channel on Slack, clarifying the authorship of the code. Third, I want Brenda Reynolds removed from any oversight of this project. Finally, I want a severance package equal to 6 months of my current salary, along with a signed agreement acknowledging my sole ownership of the Stingray trademark, which I registered under my own name on Friday evening." Brenda opened her mouth to protest, but Clara Jenkins held up a hand, demanding silence. Clara looked at Oliver Sinclair, the board member. Oliver nodded once, a brief, sharp gesture. "We will accept those terms," Clara said. "I will draft the agreement immediately. We will require you to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the details of this dispute, and you must agree not to publish the article you mentioned." "That is acceptable," I replied. "Once the funds are wired and the agreements are signed, I will transfer a limited, non-exclusive license for the wrapper code to the company. But the core machine learning logic remains mine." Within an hour, the documents were in my inbox. I reviewed them carefully with a personal attorney, signed them, and sent them back. By the end of the day, the funds had been deposited into my bank account, and the public announcement had been posted on the company's Slack. The engineering channel erupted in reactions, with developers posting fire emojis and messages of congratulations. A week later, on a Friday morning at 17 minutes past 9 in the morning, I returned to the office one last time. I was not there to work, but simply to collect my personal belongings. The office was quiet as I walked through the corridors. The engineers I passed looked at me with a mixture of awe and respect. I walked past Brenda Reynolds' office. It was completely empty. The desk had been cleared, and the nameplate on the door was gone. I learned later that the board had terminated her contract immediately after the legal team reviewed the hallway recording. Julian Croft had been stripped of his management duties and reassigned to a minor maintenance project. Toby Miller was sitting at a hot desk in the corner of the room, looking small and defeated. As I walked past, he looked up and mouthed the word thanks. He had realized that he was merely a pawn in Julian's plan to steal my work. As I waited for the elevator, Julian Croft stepped out of the conference room and approached me. His usual corporate smile was gone, replaced by a nervous, tight expression. "Daniel, I just wanted to say, no hard feelings, right?" he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I smiled. "No hard feelings, Julian. But you should know that the basic wrapper you are running is still pointing to 3 of my private API endpoints. You will want to change those configurations before they start leaking user transaction logs into an unmonitored staging bucket." Julian's face went pale. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, carrying my box of personal belongings, which included a half-dead office plant and my favorite ceramic mug. I watched the doors slide shut, leaving Julian standing alone in the hallway. By noon, I was sitting in a quiet cafe downtown, enjoying a warm cup of tea. My phone was on silent, but I could see notifications ticking upward. I had already licensed the core Stingray behavior engine to a new financial technology startup based in Zurich. The founders had wired me a consulting bonus of $25,000 and granted me a significant equity share in their new venture. I opened my laptop and saw a new email. It was an invitation to speak at a national artificial intelligence conference on the topic of intellectual property rights and ethical development. I smiled and closed the screen. I had not just saved my project. I had protected my legacy. I had built the machine, and I had walked away with its soul.